We are still in Unit 1 for our photography unit. Last time we talked about some finishing things about getting to know your camera, and we went over shots 1 through 4. Alright, we'll continue learning some shots and some photography terminology and some principles for taking good photos, but also for communicating more visually. There's basically 3 essential questions that get answered, I hope, in this photography unit, and that is, by learning photography, how can we see the familiar and unfamiliar ways? How can we bring more attention to our subject? That refers to focal point. And how can we communicate visually, or communicate more visually? A lot of these questions get answered by the photography unit. If you know anything about Sherlock Holmes, he was a master investigator, detective, because he was such a good observer. He noticed things that others didn't, and because of that he was able to solve cases. Well, a good photographer relies on their observation skills, noticing things, especially the familiar things that we take for granted, and yet being able to show something new about those familiar things in unfamiliar ways by using different photography angles and techniques. So we've gone over the 3-picture story a little bit. I'm going to skip now to shot number 5, simple portraits. The simple portrait is not the driver's license photo or the police mugshot or the birthday photo. Especially with birthday photos, it's very common to place the subject in the center of the frame with them facing the camera, or at least holding the cake straight on to the camera. Those pictures tend to come out kind of flat and boring after you've seen so many of them. Now here's a simple portrait. Instead of having the subject face directly at the camera, notice her body is angled slightly towards the camera, maybe 45 degrees. Her head's tilted a little bit over her shoulder, and also tilted vertically and looking at the camera. Now she is framed in the center of the frame. What would be better yet is to frame her off to the side and have her fill up more of the frame. When you place the subject so it fills up more of the frame, then more attention is given to your subject. Well, remember when you're taking your simple portraits to hold the shutter button halfway down so that your camera focuses on your subject. Focus, frame, and shoot. Alright, we're going to take some simple portraits to also create some effects later in Photoshop. So when you take these simple portraits against a simple background, like a one-colored background, like a white background, then it'll be easy to cut the subjects out and place them into or on top of different backgrounds. In this case, a volcano or a field. Here's another simple portrait, and this will work fine, I suppose, but notice that she's wearing white, and so later on when you try to cut out the subject, probably would be better to have a different colored background for the simple background, just so you can cut out the subject a little easier. So be aware of the color of the clothes when you're doing your simple portraits, especially for use with Photoshop projects later. As far as the composition here, she probably should be angled more to the camera and placed off to the side, as in the focus frame and shoot technique. Alright, would you please add shot number 6, silhouettes, to your shot list? Silhouettes, these are accomplished real well on blue sky days. You can still accomplish these using our simple backgrounds like we use for the simple portraits, and then make the silhouette effect happen in Photoshop. So we're looking for this kind of effect so that our subject gets dark. Again, we can make this happen in Photoshop pretty well. Here's an example where someone maybe jumped up and the sky was just pure blue in the background, and then the person took this photo and put a different background in Photoshop to make it look like the sun was in the background. Have you seen this effect other places, like some of the iPod or Apple ads from the past were famous for using the silhouette effect? Now this picture would have worked well for the blue sky example, except the camera wasn't low enough. So if the camera was low enough, then she would have been captured against a blue background up here. It's still possible to cut her out. It's just going to be more difficult because there's lots of different things happening in the background here. So you have to be aware of your space behind your subject. All right, next is the element scavenger hunt. We're looking for you to find examples of each of these, and there's lots of ways to find examples of each element. I'll go over each one individually. First one, space, and I'm thinking of the simple background again, but instead of me just calling it the background or space, I'd like you to start using the terms positive space and negative space. Positive space refers to the area in the frame taken up by your subject. Negative space is referring to the background or the space behind your positive space or negative space. In this case, hard to tell, but the positive space is this mountain range, and the sky, and I guess this is water, would be the negative space. In this picture, the positive space would be the three boys, and the negative space is the wall and the window. It's good to pay attention to what's behind your subject or your positive space. Oftentimes the negative space or the background is very distracting or interferes with your subject. In this case, the window in the background is so bright that our eyes are, remember, naturally drawn to the brightest area of the frame, and so our eyes are going to be drawn here, also to their white shirts, but that window kind of takes over. So be aware of what's behind your subject. Here we have an example of a huge area of negative space in our subject over here, or a positive space over here. This is, again, the focus, frame, and shoot, framing the subject off to the side. But this technique is used by a lot of photographers, using the negative space to emphasize the positive space. So having all this space over here actually gives emphasis to the subject over here, as opposed to if it was center focused. Here the subject takes up takes up a large amount of positive space. The subject is framed off to the side, so that's pretty good placement. We've already looked at that. Here's another example where the negative space has been blurred out to emphasize the positive space, the beetle on the stem. In this case, the negative space is somewhat distracting or busy, but the way she is placed and the fact that the background has no other elements probably gives attention to our subject, plus the lines are kind of leading us to our subject. I like how much space the subject is taking, and I like the way that she's framed off to the side. So the message there is control the negative space, control the background, and you're trying to get the subject separated from your background. Here's an example where our eyes lock into the brightest area, her white shirt, and we naturally lock onto faces. And we do that so much that we tend not to notice how distracting the negative space is. But you could do the upside down test. The upside down test shows you really how distracting that negative space is. And we don't tend to lock into our subjects, especially if they're faces, when we do the upside down test, and that makes our observations a little more accurate. Here again, the object, or the subject, excuse me, is the bird. But if we do the upside down test, we see that we are faced with a really tangled and busy background that might, in a sense, take away from the emphasis of our subject, if that's what we're going for. We'll continue with this idea in the next video.